Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And we are actually in the middle of discussing the laver with which the priests would wash their hands and their feet before they performed service in the tent of meeting, in the Mishkan, or in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple subsequently. So I'm going to put up the screen again, and we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. Just be sure you're muted if you're not. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. So here we are. So we were told yesterday that the laver should be put between the tent of meeting and the bronze altar. And Janet sent me a lovely illustration. So I'm going to do a new share. Let's see what I can do with that. Here we are. And here's an illustration of where it was put, and we can examine that a little bit carefully, because Rashi was explaining that it was slightly to the side. And here's a wonderful bird's eye view, really, of this whole portion, right? So here's the Holy of Holies. This is west, this direction. This is east down here, and that would be north, and that would be south. And he said the laver was placed slightly to the south. And we see here how things were set, that the altar was here, and it says, it looks like Amos, okay? It's Ashkenazic for Amot, which means cubits, okay? And so there was this ramp that they discussed by which one went up to the altar. And then there was this ledge here, which the priest would walk around, and then he could throw the food, whatever the animals, set the animals on the altar here to be burnt. These little squares here represent the horns of the altar. So here was the laver, you can see in between. And so they could wash their hands and feet and then head off to the ramp and head up to perform the offerings here. So just here we go, some references there. I'll go back to the other share. So we're going to continue now. The rachatzu, they shall wash. Aharon uvanav, Aaron and his sons, mimenu, from it. Aaron and his sons should wash from it. Et yedehem, their hands, ve'et, and raglehem, and their legs, their feet. And we'll see if there's Rashi on this. Yes. Back up here. Et yedehem ve'et raglehem. That's the catchphrase, right? Their legs and their feet. Bevatachat. It should be at one time, in one time. The whole process, and you'll see Rashi spells it out.
And their hands and their feet.
Yes, at one time. Haya mekadesh yadav v'raglav. He would sanctify, if we're going to use that word, right? Sanctify his hands and his feet at one time. V'kach shaninu b'v'zvachim, and this is what we learned in the tractate Zvachim. Ketzad. How was this possible? Kiddush yadayim v'raglayim. So how did the sanctification of the hands and the feet take place? How exactly did it happen? Maniach yado hayemanit al gabe raglo hayemanit. He would take his right hand and place it on his right foot. V'yado hasmalit al gabe raglo hasmalit. And he would take his left hand and place it on his left foot, umekadesh, and in that way sanctify his legs and his feet all at one time. So I imagine he'd take the water, yes, correct, and take the water and then apply it in this particular way. which of course brings me to Shira Beth is going to share with us the article that she read about the word Kadosh, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to take us off screen for a second, stop the screen share, and Shira Beth, you are welcome to share with us the article. You need to unmute. So as you're unmuting, I see David has joined us. David, we're doing this session, the Ilui Nishmat, your Abba, your father, whose Yortzeit is today. So we're doing that to dedicate our session in his memory.
Thank you.
And please God, you will have a minyan and you'll say Kaddish to Rabbanan when we're done. Okay. All right. Shira Beth, over to you.
Okay, this is just a little something from Rabbi Sachs. He's explaining, this was from Parshat Yitro actually, and he's explaining the phrase a holy nation, because I guess that's, the idea of Am Kadosh comes up there, right? So he refers to the idea that God had to shrink himself to make the world, that the infinite God fills everything, and the only place that there could be for creation would be in a place that God would vacate for the sake of creation. So that kind of is a prelude to this. And then he says, holiness is the space we make for God. If no time or space were holy, a world in which God is hidden would be for many people a world in which God does not exist. This would be a world with no limits on human self-assertion. Therefore, there must be some window, some point of transparency in the screen between the infinite and the finite. And that window is what holiness is. In the simplest and most elegant way, holiness is to humanity what Tzimtzum is to God. Tzimtzum being this shrinking down that the mystics say had to happen of God making space for the world. Just as God effaces himself to make space for mankind, so we efface ourselves to make space for God. We do this by a temporary renunciation of creativity. Holiness is that bounded emptiness filled by the divine presence. I mean, it's worth reading the whole thing. It's in his book, Covenant and Conversation, but you can see how it would apply to Shabbat, right? Where on Shabbat we stop creating. We create a holy time by restraining ourselves and create a sort of emptiness with which the divine presence could be filled. And you see how it could apply to the Holy of Holies, create an empty space for God. But that's enough. That's enough for now.
So, of course, Rabbi Sachs was a brilliant, brilliant man, and he knew how to express his thoughts so well. But I didn't feel that what you shared, which was lovely and, certainly original and added a lot, in any way contradicted what I was saying yesterday. And I'm not saying you were trying to say to contradict.
No, I don't think it contradicts anything. But it's just that when you use the word special to explain what holiness is, that doesn't convey anything to me.
Right, and that was your particular take on it, which you have every right to take. And I was trying to explain how, it led me to try to analyze what exactly we mean. So when you say the issue is that you're making a distinction. And if I were to take the model metaphorically of the binary nature of the universe, right? God would since we're talking about emptiness, right? We would say that in some sense, God is represented by the zero. Okay, and metaphorically, it's a fun metaphor to play with, that we represent, in a sense, the one, because that would represent creativity. It would represent an action of some kind, whereas the zero represents the emptiness. And yet, without the zero, the one is meaningless. And of course, they say that the whole grandeur and the amazing nature of the number system, as opposed to Roman numerals, was the introduction of the zero.
Right. Also, the zero, the image is the good one for infinity. If you're saying, how can the infinite and the finite ever meet, which is what he started from.
Mm-hmm.
That the zero is a good symbol for infinity.
Well, it is. And of course, if you divide 1 by 0, what do you get? Infinity.
Nothing. Yes.
No, you get infinity.
Right.
Okay. On the other hand, if you divide 0 by 0, you still get 1. Ironically, 0 is the only number which, divided by infinity, still gets 1. So in some ways, the number system, you could say, metaphorically, in many ways, can help us understand or get a different kind of model of what it is to believe in God. But regardless, I mean, I was pulling the word Kadosh and pulling it in different directions, all of which I felt were related in terms of understanding. So to distinguish something, right, is still to make a difference. Again, that binary, the whole idea of binariness is the ability, at the very least, to make a distinction. And of course, you see that in creation, right? Day and night, light and darkness, et cetera, et cetera. Just really underscoring this binary nature. And yet, and that binary is 0 and 1. And God's hiddenness, right? That level of hiddenness is represented by the 0. So it requires a certain level of consciousness. No, I mean, absolutely. I'm so glad you shared what you did, Shira Beth. And hopefully this is all, it tells you that this whole notion of holiness is something for us to meditate on and think about what it's really about. So, okay.
Okay. Sacrifice.
Yes, go ahead.
Because when we sacrifice, we become more holy, because that's the idea of the sacrificial whatevers. But when we sacrifice our time, our wants, our desires, that makes us more holy. So it kind of all goes in there together.
Right. So the way I'd understand it is sort of giving up. And I think it's a different iteration of the concept of whatever you want, give. That principle. So if you want something, you give it up. And then you receive it in a different kind of way. So.
But I wouldn't use the word give up, because that's a negative connotation.
Well, that's the idea of sacrificing. The whole point about sacrificing is that you're giving up something for something greater. But there has to be this notion of giving up something. And the idea of...
Or just putting something to the side.
In some cases, it might be that, but in some cases, it really might be giving up something. And maybe Golda, to respond to the point you are making, maybe that requires a rethinking on our part as to how negative giving up really is. That possibly giving up something is actually something, can be something positive.
Can make you a better whatever.
Well, there you see.
Yeah, well, it's like giving up smoking or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Or giving up shopping on Shabbat or something like that.
Well, that's the thing. And perhaps that's why people have such a great difficulty with Shabbat, because it involves sacrifice and they're not willing to make that trade. But on the other hand, knowing about this as an important principle gives life a great deal of dynamism. Right, that there's a dynamic element to life, and that as human beings, we are capable of such things. And by the way, also a heavy, heavy aspect of loving, right? Because if you're not willing to sacrifice anything, then you can't say you really love anything. because love involves putting something else in front of yourself. So we'll go back. Again, just good stuff, I think, to meditate on. We're not going to answer all the questions today, but on the other hand, if we raise some ideas to think about, that's good. I hope that's what we're doing. Let's get back into this. Okay. So let's see. Okay, we're on to the next verse, verse 20. Exodus 30, verse 20. Bevo'am el ohel mo'ed, when they enter the tent of meeting, or when they come into the tent of meeting, yirchatzu mayim, they should wash themselves with water, velo yamutu, so that they do not die. Okay, so all of a sudden we're sort of, wow, upping the level of concern. Or vegishtam el hamizbeach l'sharet, or when they draw close to go over to the altar to serve. L'haktir isha, Lashem, to cause smoke to rise for Hashem, for God. So this places a very powerful aspect to preparing themselves and washing themselves. And I just while I'm thinking about it, even if it's a little out of order, the idea of being worthy of serving, right? Of doing the preparation for this worship. And I love to quote this African-American minister who used to end his services by saying, "The worship is ending, the service is beginning." And just to not make a distinction between what we do when we're praying or studying or engaged in what we might consider holy work, as opposed to what we do the other times of our lives. And for me, this particular statement emphasizes the need to make sure that there's consistency between what we do with our secular lives and what we do in our holy time as well. So into the Rashi. Bevo'am el ohel mo'ed, when they come into the tent of meeting. And he quotes, this is Torat Kohanim, that's the Sifra on Leviticus, Parshat Shmini. So Shmini is a parsha in the book of Leviticus. And Zvachim, that's the tractate, we've already mentioned it this morning, Yud Tet, page 19. Lahaktir shacharit, so he's saying specifically when they would come to offer up smoke in the morning, uvein ha'arbayim, and in the afternoon, in the evening, ketoret would be incense, right? Lahaktir ketoret, notice the similarity of root, right? So that's one thing. In other words, either if they're bringing up incense, and the reason why it might well be mentioned in Parshat Shmini is because that's the parsha that deals with the death of Aaron and of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu. Or lehazot midam par kohen Mashiach, or to sprinkle from the blood of the bull of the anointed priest. Useirei avodat elilim, or the goats, the sprinkling of the goats on the altar. This was a goat that was brought on Yom Kippur, I believe, and that the blood was sprinkled on the altar. So the blood of the goats, the blood of if the high priest were to sin, his sin offering is far more significant than if anyone else sins, because you want to make sure that your highest officer of religious authority that represents the religious authority is as blameless as you possibly can get, and how responsible they have to be. So when we get to the book of Leviticus and they discuss the chatat offering, the sin offering, and they go through the various levels of various sin offerings, starting off with the Kohen HaMashiach, the high priest, and then going to I believe it goes next to the Sanhedrin, and then it goes next to the king, and then it goes to the common person. And each time you can see from the ceremonies involved in achieving atonement, the level of seriousness with which that particular infraction is taken. V'lo yamutu, so that they don't die. Consequently, im lo yirchatzu yamutu, that if they don't, in fact, wash their hands, they will suffer death. Sheba Torah, and Rashi goes on to explain, because the way we read the Torah, ne'emru klalot, that general rules, when general rules are given, like this one, umiklal lav ata shomeahin, from a negative statement, you can derive a positive statement, and the other way around. So if it says they will die if this happens, you can understand, then you can understand, or I should say probably they're not washing their hands. They will die if this doesn't happen, then you can understand they will live if it does happen, or vice versa, which is the way it's being put. El HaMizbeach, to the altar. And he says this El HaMizbeach refers to Hachitzon, the one outside, the one on which they brought the offerings. She'ein kan bi'at ohel mo'ed ela b'chatzer, because in this particular case, they don't actually enter the tent of meeting. So they had to wash themselves if they were going to go into the tent of meeting, but the altar itself was in the courtyard of the temple, or the courtyard that was set up. You saw the picture before, and I can show it to you again if you like, very quickly. A moment, I'll see what I can do. Here it is. And here's the court. This is the courtyard. This is the courtyard that's symbolized here. And this is, of course, the tent of meeting. So requiring both elements there, both whether they go into the tent of meeting, and certainly on the golden altar, and on Yom Kippur, they would sprinkle some blood on the golden altar, no other time, no other day. But then they obviously, when they brought offerings, many of those offerings did involve sprinkling of some kind. So. Onwards. V'rachatzu yedehem v'raglehem v'lo yamutu. Again, it's said, by the way, a second time, right? They shall wash their hands and their feet so that they do not die. V'haita lahem chok olam, and it shall be for them an eternal statute. Lo uzaro, to him and his seed forever. And that's the last little piece in the Torah right now about this kior, about this laver. You can also see that even though the position of high priest or priesthood was a privileged position, it came with attendant danger and the need to be very, very careful about everything you did. As I think I've mentioned before, everything that the priests did had to be done with a great deal of concentration and focus. And you can see that the stakes were quite high. Let's see here, Kaf Aleph, here it is. V'lo yamutu, so that they don't die. L'chayev mita, this brings, the reason why it said a next time, is it obligates death. Al hamishamesh, regarding one who serves at the altar, right? The mizbeach, at the altar, the enor rachutz yadayim v'raglayim, and has not washed his hands and his feet. Shemimita harishona lo shamanu. Okay, because in that first verse that we read, we only learned out, okay, only on one who went into the sanctuary area, and not necessarily the one who went up on the altar outside. So he's explaining why we have to repeat this verse about the capital punishment regarding one who did not sanctify their hands and their feet prior to service. And with this, we'll conclude our session today. And stop.